Good morning, Boker Tov. We will ask everybody to join in the table because we're kind of workshop, so we want to be together. I thought that after I'll introduce our masters, this class masters ceremony having this morning, we will make kind of a round table to introduce each other to each other. And we're very happy and pleased to have two very important guests, part of our 12-member mission of science journalists from all around the world. Those of you who was yesterday in the conference, just a briefing about yesterday. We're part of international science and editor bloggers mission to Israel, that the Israel Academy of Sciences. My name is Ovadia, and I'm the spokesperson of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities and Academia Biשראל למדעים. And we have made a special mission with some colleagues of ours, Mishkenot Sha'ananim, and the Jerusalem Press Club, and the Safra Center here at the University of Tel-Aviv. And there's a delegation of 12 people, very valued friends of ours, colleagues from all around the world, and Daniela, Ovadia, and Fabio Turone are two of those mission. Let me tell you a little bit about Daniela and Fabio. Daniela is a science journalist with a background of medicine and neuroscience. She writes for the Italian edition of the Scientific American, and she's a board member of the Professional Association of Science Writers in Italy. Fabio is the editor-in-chief of the agency ZOI, for scientific and medical information, which is based in Milan, and he's the president of the Professional Association for Science Writers in Italy. So, without any further ado, let's make a round table with, how can we do the Nelly with that?
What?
Is it for the record? Let's try. So let's make it quick. Everybody introduce themselves and where they're coming from, and I hope we'll have an enjoyable artist masters class.
Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Chaim Chaim. I'm a PhD from postdoc from the Weizmann Institute, and I run the section Ask the Expert on the Davidson Institute on the website.
What's your research field?
I'm a biochemist.
Okay, just to know what's your...
Okay, I'm Erez Garti. I'm also from the Weizmann Institute. I'm a PhD student. I'm an immunologist, and I'm also co-editor at the Davidson Online website at the Multimedia Archive section.
Hi, good morning. My name is Tzaf Klein from Porter School for the Environmental Studies. My research is on the use of cannabis in medicine. I'm also a film director.
I also work at the Institute. I coordinate many programs of science education and background controls, medical research and theater management.
Hi, I'm Hila Peleg. I'm a master's student in computer science over here at Tel-Aviv University, but I feel the need to talk myself up after the esteemed row of colleagues. So I tried to answer questions about polio on the internet this summer. I noticed.
Well, I'm from the Tech, and I'm a master's student in material. Please join us.
Hi.
Good morning. My name is Esti Laszlo. I'm a doctoral student at Daniela in the Technion, and my background is in biology. I'm working in public debate and scientific literacy.
I just managed to keep myself. presentation. My name is Leo, and I'm a master student for neuroscience, and I deal with animal models for depression.
My name is Daniela. I'm a doctoral student and I teach a graduate writing course at the Technion, and my background is in linguistics, and I'm researching really what I'm working on, just teaching writing.
Yoram Raik, a professor in engineering from Tel-Aviv University and also president of Israel Institute for Empowering Ingenuity.
I'm C, and I'm doing a master's in linguistics here in Tel-Aviv University.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Turone from the Research Authority, Tel-Aviv University.
Good morning, my name is Moti Medina. I'm a PhD student in computer engineering. I'm also mentoring in this Davidson Institute for mentoring young students in science in the near or far future. And my main research is on computer science theory, and more specifically algorithms, online algorithms, representation algorithms, etc. I'm also a co-author of a new published book on how to teach digital audio design, and also teaching assistant. So mainly I appear in most of this PhD comics that you see all the time. The guy that does everything and all the time frustrated about that he has no time. So that's me.
Rose Levy, I'm a PhD student in computer science.
Hi, I'm Agaz, I'm a PhD student for biotechnology. Hello, my name is Sopher. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Department of Education at the University. My research field has to do with achieving goals, implementation, and conceptual change in science. And I carry my research helps decision making and epistemic thinking.
Dr. Joel, professor of psychology and science here in Tel-Aviv. My main research areas are sex, gender, and brain, and the main ideas I try to promote are that brains do not have sex and humans do not have gender.
Hi, I'm Rebecca, and this is my colleague Tal. We're from the Technion Faculty of Biotechnology and Food Engineering, and we represent the iGEM team for the Technion for November 2014. iGEM is a competition in synthetic biology. It's held by MIT, and we came to represent iGEM, synthetic biology.
So, good morning, I am Tal. And only add the faculties share our team with 30 students from computer science, from biochemistry, from biotechnology, and from mathematics, physics. Very interdisciplinary team.
Would you join us please to the table?
On the other side.
Can we ask you to join the table? So that we'll squeeze a little bit. Do you have a seat?
My name is Stefan Deutsch. I have a PhD in engineering from the Technion. My research field is management of technology and innovation. And I'm also a student of narrative research at the University of Milan.
Could you introduce himself?
Eli Piasecki, and I'm a physicist from the School of Physics and Astronomy here at Tel-Aviv University.
Again, I'm a PhD in health physics, working at the Solar Research Center, and my expertise in radiation protection, serotonin, power frequency.
Hi, I'm Sophie Shauli. I'm from the Technion, PhD doctor, PhD student, from PhD in
Ovadia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Shalom everybody, and thank you for coming. You are from very different fields, but you are all scientists in some way. So we are trying, this is a sort of experiment because it's not easy to manage a different audience from another country, from different cultural backgrounds. So I hope it will be interesting for both of us to discuss what happened in Italy, but could be something that could happen everywhere in the world, and how you as scientists and we as journalists how we can manage when we have very difficult situation to help the population to understand what is the real issues in science, and not only in science, because as you know, often science has a huge social and ethical background that we have to express as journalists, and that you have to take care of as scientists. So we decided to choose this story because it's a story, it's an ongoing story that didn't end at the moment, and it's a debate that went international because a lot of pieces were written about this story on Nature and Science, and you can find them if you are interested then. And so let's start with a small introduction, like a case story. We will tell you what happened in Italy, and then we will discuss all together on what is our idea on how to deal with this kind of situation, what are the sources that we use as journalists and that you think we should use as journalists, because you are our one of the stakeholders of every kind of scientific story on newspapers and on journals and reviews. So I give the microphone to Fabio Turone, who will...
Keep that microphone, I sit here and we can watch each other easily. Well, the headline here is, I don't know how many people know about a filmmaker called Peter Turone, who used this kind of title, this echoes a movie which is called The Cook, his wife and his lover, with this kind of, and this is one of the starting points that is needed to attract attention. But the story itself is very important. This is the picture of a psychologist who teaches psychology at the University of Udine. And his name is Davide Vannoni, and he also was the president of a company called Cognition, which offers services like communication and market research. He established in 2009 a foundation called Stamina Foundation to deliver treatments, so-called treatments in brackets, based on stem cells. The starting assumption is that he claims that he was cured in 2007 in Ukraine for facial hemiplegia. We know that at least one patient in 2008 was paid, after paying 40,000 euro, died after a few years from the diagnosis for Parkinson, which is clearly not such a deadly disease in itself. And we also know from another patient that he paid 12,000 euros for the therapy, and he complained an epileptic seizure after the infusion of stem cells. These and other complaints led the police to start an investigation in 2010, which ended temporarily because the legal system in Italy is quite slow, with a decision to bring to court 12 people, including Professor Davide Vannoni. At the time, the Stamina Foundation had received the promise of a big public grant for developing these self-declared therapies by the region of the Piedmont. We still don't know exactly how it could be possible, but when the investigation broke, the police investigation broke, that grant was withdrawn. In the same year, a small trial on 5 children was brought in a public hospital in Trieste, an informal trial in a way, but in any case there was a publication claiming that there was no proof of improvement and that basically the inconclusive results were mostly negative. But in 2010, 2 patent requests are in any case filed to the US Patent Office. And this is important because these patents keep resurfacing in the public debate as the proof that there is a protocol, that there is a therapy, and that there is industrial secrets involved. The point is that upon journalistic investigation, it was clear that of those 2 patents, one was discarded by the US Patent Office and the other one was withdrawn by the proponents themselves. Nevertheless, the story continued in 2011 with the 2 characters, the physician who did the study in Trieste and Professor Vannoni, who moved to another hospital in another region. We know why they did move and why they found a public hospital in London, because one of the first patients, maybe the first patient who wanted to undergo this pretended treatment in this public hospital, was one of the high-ranking officials deciding in the health authority of the Lombardy region. So he signed this agreement, being personally interested in getting that pretended treatment. That was made possible by a loophole in the European legislation, because this was presented as compassionate use, despite the fact that the European law on compassionate use of experimental treatments states that the experimental treatment has to be or should be tested, should have some evidence, if not definite evidence, before formal approval. There must be some evidence of effectiveness and safety, of course. Even after that, in the public hospital in Brescia, in northern Italy, the police, the health authorities, central health authorities, sent an inspection, and they found that the laboratory was totally inadequate to deal with stem cells. So they did not respect the basic scientific rules for manipulating stem cells. And this is another complex point we will get into detail when it comes out. The Italian Drug Regulatory Authority, AIFA, at that point orders that all procedures are discontinued, so that the patients who are being subjected to treatment are not anymore allowed in the hospital, and that no new patients are accepted. The point is at this point that many families of little children with incurable diseases go to courts and ask, based on the Italian Constitution, which is a great piece of paper that states that we have the right to health, they asked judges, and many judges allowed the family to receive that therapy in public hospitals.
Sorry, just an important point. This therapy was, Dr. Vannoni said that this therapy is useful for every kind of neurodegenerative disease. That means not only adult diseases like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Parkinson, Alzheimer, but also leukodystrophia or any kind of inborn or genetic neurodegenerative disease. So there are many involved in this story because, as you know, these are diseases that you cannot treat in any way, and generally they end with the death of a young patient after a few months or years. It depends on the disease. So you can imagine what the situation and the emotional burden of the situation.
So the question moves from does it work to why not try it with public money, by the way. And the TV steps in. This is an infotainment transmission and broadcast called The Hyenas, which occasionally covers health-related issues, which decides that they have to save little Sophia. And so Sophia is the name of a 3-year-old baby with a nasty disease, and they start to promote, to ask publicly that the Ministry of Health intervenes to provide that therapy again. The images speak by themselves. They show before and after, which doesn't make much sense scientifically, but is very effective if you show this kind of picture, and recruits very famous folk singers to exactly ask for the treatment to be provided. During the process, many scientists are asked to evaluate the situation, and this is one of the most highly respected stem cell experts in Italy, the director of the stem cell laboratory at the University of La Sapienza in Roma, Dr. Pavia, who is presented like the scientist who is against the process, against the hyenas, and basically against the fight for life of the little Sophia who is presented in the picture. And this is the kind of the rally in front of the parliament in Rome, in which the signs say, let us cure our children, yes to life, yes to stamina, and it's not the disease that kills us, it's you who sentence us to death, which becomes the fault of all the incurable diseases is on the shoulders of the people who needs to decide whether or not they are going to provide these treatments. So the health minister at the time, because it has changed meanwhile, decided to allow the treatment still in the form of compassionate therapy, so which is bending the rules in a way. And in April, the Italian Senate approved this year a decree that basically changed the definition of stem cell therapy, so that it's not stated that it didn't have to be considered as a drug with all the safety tests needed for new drugs, but instead like a transplant, which implies much less regulation beforehand. At the same time, a little after, the new House of Representatives, the newly elected House of Representatives, voted to fund with public money a huge clinical trial with 3 million euro of public money to go look into this self-defined stamina protocol. And now we leave it a moment to the floor. Daniela, go ahead.
Okay, so this is the story, and of course this is the point where the science journalists started to be interested in the story and started. Yeah, it's
beginning of this year.
Yeah, this year.
13.
Yeah, 13. So the story went. We have news about this, but we stopped here because this was a very important moment for the media, because science journalists started to ask themselves, how can I deal with this story? How can I explain to the people what are the scientific basis of this story? How can I be clear in explaining this? What are the pitfalls of this story, and what are the risks that are involved? How can I explain what's the scientific point of view on stem cells research and on protocols that we have to follow that are for the human security, that was established for human security. So what I want now to do with you is just to, can we switch it off? Yeah. I want you to just imagine that you have to cover this story, and you are a science journalist and you're not an expert on stem cell research, because we are not. We are, I mean, many of us have a scientific background, but we are, I'm an expert in neuroscience, another one can have a physics PhD and so on. So we are not experts. We are experts in telling stories, but we are not experts in every field of science. So what I want you to do is to tell me what, in your beliefs, are the sources I have to find before when I start covering the topic. Where do I have to go to find what I call neutral information on this kind of stories, on stem cells research, on how to apply it to patients? So just tell me, and I write them and I put them on post-it. I want to have a list of sources of what you think are sources that I need to cover this. So please, just tell me. Go to PubMed. Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. It's better. Other sources. Sorry, I can't.
Other researchers.
Other researchers. Okay. Other researchers. Hospitals. Who in hospitals?
The head department that dealing with stem cells. Oh, this.
Oh, okay. So clinicians, you say, clinicians dealing with. For what you intend for academia is researchers, and you are clinical. The doctor is clinical. Okay.
I think that health authorities, somebody who is supposed to approve treatments, ought to tell you, the sources, and on the other hand, what is required as a scientific evidence to be approved.
So you think that is health authorities that can tell me what is required? Okay. Sorry, I have them like this because I have to put. Health authorities, PubMed Research Commission, health authorities. Something else?
Yeah. You want to find an expert in expert in stem cells.
Expert in stem cells. Do you think we can put it in other researchers or okay?
I thought, but I understood that other researchers think not necessarily.
Okay. Okay. An expert in stem cell research. Yes.
Someone seeking the treatment to explain why they're seeking the treatment.
Okay. So something we are going in more detail. Yeah. Someone seeking for treatment. Just a moment because we can. Yes.
Stem cell lab producers.
Stem cell lab producer industry in some way. Yeah, this is interesting, like biotech. Yes.
For each of these sources, you need to look for the funders of these studies.
We are arriving to this point. Yes,
and
of course.
There's another one. Given
biotech and the lab.
Given this particular treatment, who is going to suffer if it becomes approved? Companies that are going to lose money and so forth.
So economical background of okay.
The politics of science.
Yeah. So science policy.
I think it
follow money. Follow money.
The citizens are better to look at the money, right?
Okay. So maybe something has a background in science policies and economics. There was another hand raised somewhere, no? Yeah.
Many colleagues from the other countries, like
yeah.
a
fellow
journalist from from Australia that have done the deepest similar.
Okay. Yeah, this is interesting too. Other journalists. So I'm writing a story on this. So yes.
One more thing, the basic textbook on the topic. Many times journalists don't have the basic knowledge of fundamentals of the subject.
Okay, background material. Yeah, background material. Okay. So you think, is there anything else? Okay. It's a good idea, a bioethicist. Okay, so do you think I can cover this story on a newspaper? I think there is something missing here to cover the story.
The
doctor who actually made the treatment.
Yeah, of course. The doctor and patients. Yeah, of course. We are missing the other side, which is patients and parents. Yes, people involved in the story. Yes.
When you say that, do you mean the ones that would like to undergo the treatment, or ones that have already undergone it? I mean, if you're, I don't think it's very wise, I don't know, to include the ones that would like to go through the treatment, because that becomes just yellow, and it's just journalism and not, I don't know, science journalism.
This is a really interesting point. Okay.
The ones who were already recruited, but not the ones who would like to be recruited?
No. Just that to avoid interviewing people involved, patients involved or wanting to be involved in the trial, because they are, of course, they are interested.
They have a kid who's sick.
So this is no. It's really interesting what you said. That this would be journalism and not science journalism. And I think this is a very interesting thing to discuss, if there is really a difference between journalism and science journalism, and which kind of difference. Okay?
I mean, it would be like tabloidic, not like journalism as I would have liked it to be.
This is okay. We will discuss this point. Yeah. So patients, but not involved, patient who don't want to be involved in the trial. I mean, patients with the same kind of disease, but treated with official treatments.
Or otherwise, patients, you said that there have been patients actually gone through
patients
the
who paid a
Oh.
Okay, and no, it's not okay. So I'm sorry, but it's not so easy to speak like this, but we will try.
Maybe take the seat, and in the meanwhile we'll manage that.
Okay. So we have a long list. Is there anything missing? Or we stop here?
Patients and parents who already underwent.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So I really have to wake up. I'm sorry, because I cannot do this job. Because what I want to do now, I try to speak in the microphone for registration. Switched off. What I want to do now is to build with you a pro and cons column about each of these sources. Okay, what we were saying. Yeah, what you have to be. Why is can we trust in them in everything they are saying to the journalist, and what are the pro and cons? Okay. It's important for a journalist, and it's important for scientists too. You will see at the end, because you are part of this story. So let's start with a journalist abroad, which is simple. What are the pro of asking a colleague abroad?
They're objective, but they might hide some of the details because they might want to scoop or something. Although it's not ethical.
They are objective, but they miss some points.
I'm not sure how objective they are. I'm not sure how you can trust objectivity of.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
They have no interests in money-wise or research-wise. They just want to tell the story. So this is They might be wrong.
They might be wrong. Yeah.
But they have no mathematics.
Okay, I can tell you that one of the journalists who covered this story is Alison Abbott, who is covering health and news for Nature in the whole Europe. And she wrote a piece that was published on Nature on this story that was really, who missed very important points of the story we can see together. And I think that it was also because, not because she's from abroad, because she lived in Italy and she knows very well the country, but because of her point of view, which is really, how can I say, Anglo-Saxon point of view, something that, okay, we have point 1, point 2, and the end of the story is the point 3. But here we have many stakeholders involved, and we have a very important emotional and social question to take care of, and this is something that was missed in her piece. So certainly it's interesting for us to ask, and that's why I think it's always useful to discuss abroad this kind of story. There are similar stories in many countries. I mean, I don't know if you have some, not exactly the same thing, but I can tell you that as part of my job is to teach neuroethics in the University of Pavia, and I often deal with the question of coma patients. And I remember when you had the story of Sharon and the study that Mario Monti did on Sharon last year, I think that you had the same problem with the patients with coma patients in Israel, that you have, how can I say, sometimes you have hypes that you have to explain to the public. It's not exactly the same thing, but in some way, if you have the experience from colleagues from abroad that dealt, yeah. This is the paper from Nature.
It was basically Italian stem cell trial based on flowed data. Scientists raise serious concerns about a patient that forms the basis of a controversial stem cell therapy, which is very much pushed on the quality of science.
Okay. So, yes, this is important to have. There are countries where they are more smarter about these kind of things. Just to say, in the United Kingdom there is the Science Media Center, which is like an institution who helps scientists and journalists dealing with this kind of topics, giving exactly what we were discussing, background information, connection and networks, and so they have some expertise in how to deal with this kind of crisis. So yes, it's important for us. What about background materials? What are the pros and cons of background materials?
Only pros.
Only pros?
They might be obsolete. It depends what are your sources. I mean, if you go to Wikipedia, then...
No, it's absolutely.
Yeah, and I should say also that your colleague said the basic textbooks. Okay, I have the last edition of the Candle Neuroscience textbook, and it was edited maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, it's an old book. If I have to deal with treatments that are the frontiers of like stem cell research is, it's changing every day. So I think that textbook and background materials, as you as scientists think about it, that is textbooks, all the chapters and so on, it's not really a good source for journalists.
It is, because you must first of all explain to the public, and you must do it in very simple terms, and probably what was meant here was that there you can find the basis of something similar.
Yes, that's true. You can find a basic definition of what is a stem cell, just to say, or what is a treatment, of course. But probably it's difficult to explain to the public what's going wrong in this specific kind of treatment, of course. But pro, we say simple basic information. And cons is sorry. Okay.
And I can add a question. In case you have a lot of background materials differing a little bit, which one should we choose? But we have a lot of Wikipedia, the Campbell, whatever. Who selects the real basic points and who simplifies the concept?
When I said the textbook, I meant the one that is written by scientists based on scientific evidence, not necessarily.
In the United States, when you have to bring a scientific evidence to court, they use something that is called Frye test. The Frye test, it's a law, the Frye criteria. And the Frye criteria is that for a court is scientific something that is accepted by the majority of the science community, which is in some way a compromise, because of course you always have to kind of...
Which is in some way anti-scientific, because there was a specific example I can bring you of a physician in the United States who, concerning the testing with the PSA for the prostate-specific antigen in search of the prostate cancer, he used the best available evidence, which says you should not undergo that test without specific reasons and on the general population. Then the patient sued the doctor, who followed strictly the best clinical guidelines existing in the world. But in the court,
because the patient developed the cancer.
Then if the patient had cancer, and the court sentenced that physician, because in the court they asked other physicians from the community to say, what do you do? And they all said, I do the PSA, but they were physicians and they were not scientists. So the scientific evidence in that case was overruled by what the majority of physicians in that country in the United States, it was in Texas if I'm not mistaken, currently did, which was not scientific but was sufficient to be approved by the court.
There is always a gap between what we call the theoretical science and the applied one. And when we deal with patients and with stories involving patients, but also in environmental stories and so on, we have to understand that there is a gap between what we think is the theory and what is done. And what one of the role of science journalism is to fill this gap and understand why and explain to the public what's the difference and why. Why? I suppose that in Israel too, doctors prescribe prostate antigen test to almost every man after 50 years old. And this is, and if you read the guidelines, I think there is maybe one, not one that says that we have to do this kind of screening on the whole population. But it's something that everybody does. Why? Why? Because it's something that doctors, the feeling of the doctor is that I'm protecting someone, I'm protecting my patient. It's not scientifically evident, but it's something very, very strong in our psychology, and we have to deal with this when we discuss. Yes?
Just to add to this point, even when it is very scientific, for example, 4 years ago there were mature stem cells that became normals, was published in Nature, in the translation that was written in the more popular journalism. I think it gave the impression that maybe in 1 or 2 or 3 years we can implant neuron cells in the brain, and I mean there is a huge gap, even when it is scientific, between what's actually happening in the lab, where they were able to do that, and all the applications for society.
Okay. Now, I have an interesting question on this. Whose fault is?
Journalists.
Really?
But the one in the story.
Yeah.
I know that all the time very careful about what they say, because they know that people can understand different things and that what can be done. So most of the time they're really, really careful, at least the one that I know. And I think that most of the time journalists look for someone that, something that people want to read. And people want to read about how the relative that now have a disease, he can survive in 4 years, but not in 12 years, so they hope that he will get better.
Okay. Well, now I have something to say about this. How a journalist is aware of a new research? Do you know how?
Press release.
Press release. Okay. And what do you think is written in the press release?
The things that he has to check. Like, it's the most fantastic thing that was ever invented.
Okay, so you mean the scientist relies on his public information office or public PR office of the university. The professionals in the university PR office are supposed to stretch the limit in the press release, and then it's up to the journalist to check and to tone down the hype in the press release. I agree with you, but I also think that I agree with you because I'm a journalist and I insist on the journalists that we should know that the premise is that the manipulation starts with the scientist. And this is an important point, I think, because we have also a lot of evidence about this, but it is not so obvious for most scientists to understand.
If you ever read the PR of your work, you know immediately that they don't understand and they exaggerate everything you said. So
Yeah.
if you undergo as a scientist, if you undergo this process, you know.
I should say that it's not only a problem of the PR, and it's also a problem from the review journals. Just to say, the press release on the neuron stem cell differentiation, I remember it because it was a Nature press release. And Nature has a huge interest in being covered, of course, because as you probably know, and if you don't know, we can tell you that there are many research published on scientific news, on scientific reviews that demonstrate that if a research is covered by a public media, a common public, then the impact factor of the research is higher than if it's not covered. This is the same. Just because your colleagues are aware of your research just reading the newspaper, so you will be cited more and more if you are, if you're...
It is counterintuitive for a scientist, but the truth is that scientists rely on the lay press also for evaluating the relevance in their own field. So this is something that we teach our colleagues, journalists, but it's something that is part of the system. So which also has all the interest to get grants depending on the impact factor, on the number of publications, on the relevance of the publications, and so on. So it's
So yes.
Eventually, the public gets this information from the journalism. I mean, there is, even though we would like scientists to say exactly what's going on and not their plans for 10 years, I see that it's not 50-50 in the responsibility, because what grades could have, it could be even 51 and 49, for the journalism. Because this is how people get the information. It doesn't come directly from the science.
Yes.
This is a question how you are able, and what is the, of course, I mean, in an ideal world, the scientist would give the story as is, it's a very small and step-by-step process and everything, how science really is going on. But I do think that there is even 1%.
Yes.
I think it's misunderstanding of what is science and what is journalism, because I don't think science is about truth, and having that someone now publishes maybe only 10 or 20 years, we will know if she was correct or she was wrong in what she's saying. And usually the interesting things are the things that are against what science now thinks, and this will what will get to you. And I think in the same sense, journalists should not decide what is true, because they don't have the what is needed, the tools. Even scientists in the same field don't know if it's true or not. That's the whole point. So how can a journalist that is not an expert in the field judge? So I don't think the work or the duty of the journalist is to be the judge and to tell us what is true. I think what journalists should do is give us different angles. So if I publish something, then you should find other researchers that think opposite to me or with me, and then give the public different views, and each one can judge for himself.
This is very interesting.
So it's a majority rallying in the streets before, in front of the parliament who decides whether or not the health system should pay for that treatment?
That's a good question. How do we make policies? And how, because the policies not journalists and not scientists are making, but how policies are made, it's a very important question. Of course, journalists can affect this, but I think believing, I mean, you should not believe that you can tell the truth or you can find the truth. It's true, you have power, and you can make people change their minds. But I think not believing that we know the truth, both as scientists and as journalists, I think it's, it's a good starting point.
I think it's interesting because she said exactly the opposite, that what you're saying is journalism, but science journalism is something that is different from journalism. So I would say that you're saying that no, as a science journalist, I'm a journalist, so I have to give the broader picture I can of the situation, and then let my reader decide what is good enough. And yes.
Okay, but when you give both sides, then there comes a situation that, give an example from an extreme situation in Israel, that there was a discussion about chemotherapy, and on one side was the head of the oncological department in the hospital, and the other side was a concerned parent that doesn't want to give his sick child the chemotherapy. So it's not always balanced, there's not always two sides. There are two sides, but one of them is wrong.
No, but the two sides is not the parent and the physician. It's a physician and another physician that has a different
It
should be on the same.
I would say, but pay attention. We had something like, I work for the Italian Agency for Cancer Research, so I often deal with this kind of things. And in the general, I mean, many journalists perceive the balance in the way that if you have chemotherapy oncologist that wants to give chemotherapy, then the other side is to go, I don't know, to an homeopath. And so I think if I take your explanation in the way you gave it, so it's always another part of the discussion. Of course, the homeopathy exists. I would prefer not, but it exists. So you are yes, but then the journalist is starting to judge that something is more important than something else, and we have both, as scientists and journalists, have tools to decide that what we call a balanced article is not to put garbage in it.
Not to mention one important aspect, which is a difference between a scientist and a journalist, is that you, as a scientist, you have a pressure to publish, but you basically decide what your attention should go to and when you are ready for publishing. For the journalist, it's the opposite. So the reality outside sets the time, sets the issue, and then you have to put out something in a couple of hours, and with very strict limits of space often. So you have to be judgmental, and you have to be certain that you are as complete as possible in looking for who has the right to speak. Because I think that this example is very important because, in fact, the impossibility of evaluating whether we should intervene in a way in the debate until it was a debate pushed up by a stupid TV emission that insisted on stupid points, then you can ignore it, or you need to evaluate how much and when you need to step in, and then you need to evaluate what's the right move to do. And typically, the first reaction by the scientific community is to put the blame on the journalists, which is the kind of, so I tend to say, yes, it's most of the fault is on the journalists, because I work on that, and that's the part I want to see as the part I can influence and I can act on. But then the point is not establishing 51-49. The point, in my view, is learning and accepting the idea that when you face complex issues like this, values come in the debate. And so you need also to include the parent of the sick children, one way or the other, because you cannot just say you don't have a science to add to the debate, because it's not only science we are talking about. We're talking about sick child and incurable diseases. So the selection of what's relevant is, I think, the point, because what's most important in this, I would like to discuss together.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, but we have half an hour, and I want to go to the point.
Yes, we divided journalism and science journalism before, and I don't completely agree with this. I mean, every journalist should have a very good sense of skepticism. And we have a very famous story here in Israel about some singer named Chaim Tsinovich, I think. He couldn't publish his music. He couldn't get to radio stations and stuff. So he invented a story that he got burned in some fire, and now he's all covered with bandages, and he still sings, and he came to a newspaper and he told his story, and he came with the wheelchair and all the bandages and everything, and the story got published, and of course his music got published also. And later on, we learned that it was all a cover story. Yeah, it was fake. And that journalist didn't do his work. He wasn't skeptical. He didn't check all the facts that he should have checked.
Yeah.
And
it would have been very simple, because if you have a fire, you have reports in police and so on. So in this case,
exactly.
It's really easy to check if it's true or not.
And it relates to the original question we stopped here about the background material. That it's not, you can't divide the different sources of data to something that is very basic and something that is on a subject. I think you should do research on all the subjects and all the sources. And I use Wikipedia also as a beginning to look to where to look, and PubMed and reviews, and
yes,
it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, I would say that there are, between scientists, there are a lot of prejudice against Wikipedia and so on, but I don't know if you know that all the researchers on the time that, of course, between an error in a Wikipedia file and the correction of the error is very, very short. They did a lot of research. If I write on Wikipedia something wrong, it will be corrected in less time than if I write it in a peer-reviewed paper. So in some way, there is I mean, I agree that I don't trust only in Wikipedia, but in some way, we have to think about what the community, the network is doing. It's a sort of big peer review in some way. Okay, everybody can correct. If you're a scientist and you see that something is wrong in a Wikipedia piece that is in your field, you just go in and correct it. So I think that scientists have a lot of prejudice on what are the reliable sources, and I think that this is important for you, because maybe one day you will be interviewed by someone, and you can be really helpful if you give some background materials that you trust in, but that are simple enough for someone who is not in the field. And this is a very important job that you can do.
And of course, it cannot go read the chemistry book from page 1, because nobody would. So it has also to be proportional to the time available for journalists.
Yeah, I would say let's say what are the pros and cons of ethicists, of calling a bioethicist. The pro.
It's a different point of view.
You can go into the story.
Of course, there are also. Because in this story there are many ethical issues. But what are the cons?
I think that it's very public in the way to bioethicists, or the have it be one side of the story, but the public see it as a thing, what relates to this.
This could take away one kind of point.
Yeah.
Someone's reading and say, oh,
I completely agree with you, but as I told you, I'm also a neuroethicist, and I can tell you that it's very difficult to say what is ethics. There is not one bioethics. So, I mean, I feel this really strongly in Italy because it's a very Catholic country. And, okay, I'm Jewish, so I have a different point of view on this. And, I also have to cover what is not, I don't follow only the Jewish ethics when I have to give an advice on something. I also have to deal with a laik point of view, as a non-religious point of view on ethics, and I can tell you that it's often 2 or 3 different points of view. I mean, Jewish bioethics is more open than the Catholic one, but anyway, sometimes I have 3 different points of view. And so when you call a bioethicist, you have to know what kind of bioethicist you're calling. And I can tell you that we had a debate in Italy about research on embryos. And we had what we call a referendum. So we voted if we accept or not to allow research on embryos, on human embryos. And people didn't went to vote. Didn't go to vote because because a lot of Catholic bioethicists went on TV or were interviewed on the media and said that this is a very difficult issue and it's better for common people not to give an advice on this and to let the parliament and the scientists to decide. And so it's something that has a huge social impact because we have a lot of genetic diseases in some regions of Italy, especially in the islands, because there was a lot of endogamy and so on. So it was important for them, but they realized after that now we cannot do research on embryos, human embryos in Italy, but the families and the people realized that this is a problem only after a few years that this decision was taken. So which kind of bioethicist are you calling? So I have maybe 2,000 bytes for my article, and I have to call at least 2 bioethicists. I mean, the Jewish one is not important in Italy, so let's say a Catholic one and a non-Catholic and a laik one. So I have 2. I need 2, at least, if not more. So this is the problem with ethics when you put ethics in.
And this risks to even polarize further the issue, depending on the issue. Instead of discussing science, you start discussing religion, for instance.
This is very common in our country, and I think in Israel too. I'm not used to it.
Science is also religion.
Of course, it is. Of course. Science is something that involves also a social and ethical and religious beliefs, of course. So we have to discuss, but I'm saying that it's not a single point of view, it's different point of view. And what about PubMed? Can we rely on PubMed? So I'm a journalist, I go and I put stem cells research and stem cells. I get everything.
You get everything.
I get everything.
So you have to be very careful.
Okay.
And then you can find very good links there. Of course. Scientists.
You can cherry pick. Especially if you have already your idea, you can find whatever you want to reinforce, to provide evidence for your idea.
This is something that scientists often use. When they go, when a scientist has this point of view, it often goes to the TV and say, you say there is a research published on science and these are the data. And what about the other 2,000 researchers that said a different thing? So of course you can do cherry picking. So this is PubMed, of course it's science, but you have everything in it. So someone has to give you an advice on how to deal with this information. What about other researchers?
They have their agenda.
They have their own agenda.
Indeed, it's much more easy to understand the situation when you talk with someone that is expert in the field. They also can explain you the basic science of the field without you go and read all Wikipedia or all the textbooks.
Of course. But it has they have their own agenda. In this story,
They wanted their own agenda.
of course, but I give you I give you an example. 2 years ago, I wrote a book on diabetes with a very well-known Italian researcher who stays in Miami, which is Camillo Ricordi. He's the one who invented the pancreatic islet transplant. So, he's a very important researcher in the field. And he does research on stem cell because he's trying to build islets, pancreatic islets from stem cell. He has his own agenda. His agenda is that he wants the regulation of stem cell research to be less strict. He says he agrees with the idea that stem cell is because he has his own agenda. Of course, yes.
But it's very important to know which questions to ask. But if you ask about what he believes in, I don't think it's a relevant question. But if you ask him what are the facts, what is the science, it's something that he cannot lie.
Of course, Leah, he can. He can say what
he can cherry-pick which information he provides.
Obviously, you said when you talk to a scientist, you can say all the time that this is amazing and it's going to change the world. Every time.
You can say different things also on very technical points. Just to give you an example, I asked Ricordi, what do you think about this kind of protocol they published? That was not a protocol, that was the problem. So the health, there weren't all the steps, and they said we cannot say the steps because there is an industrial interest secret behind. So, and I said, how can you say that this is a protocol? And he told me, yes, of course it's a protocol. Just come in Miami, you will see that our protocols are written like this. And I know that it's not true. I know because I know his protocols. And what can I say? I know because I wrote a book with him, but if I was a journalist outside, I would believe in him because he is an important scientist.
Because there are personal issues between him and some of the scientists who fight in Italy this specific war. So he would stick on the opponents because of the human idea, the enemies, the friends of my enemies are my enemies, and the enemies of my enemies are my friends. So this is the mechanism.
Yeah, there is politics in science too. We have to understand, to be aware of this. Sometimes there is politics, and in this story there is a lot of politics, because there are scientists who are, sympathize with the party that allowed the trial. There are scientists who are from the left parties that are against the trials, and so politics is important also. There are scientists who never gave their advice on this because they don't want to be involved in politics also. So. What about clinicians?
Same thing.
Yeah.
Same thing.
You get the common practice, but not the very cutting edge.
Yeah.
And they might have a little. If they have
Might.
on it.
But I think nobody asked. I can tell you that at the beginning of the story, no journalist asked a clinician, and this was an error. And I tell you why. Because some of the benefits, the supposed benefits of this stem cell trial in babies you can explain them with the normal development of the brain. Also in a sick baby. They are, when they started the trial, Sophia, one of the girls, was 1 year old. Then the second video that we have where she moves a little bit more than the first one, she's 3 years old. And of course, also if you have a neurodegenerative disease, your brain is developing like every brain of every baby. So we can explain a little bit this.
Before and after is not
comparable, and this is something that any clinician involved in this kind of diseases can tell you. And it was a very important information that was missed in the first reporting. So I think that clinicians are important. What about health authorities? Yes.
I would like to say something about clinicians and maybe to connect it to the ethical issues that was raised before. clinicians have this habit of being very conservative because they are worse than engineers in the sense that if something works, don't touch it, okay? So if some procedure worked for the last 50 years, they won't do anything to change it or to add new ingredients to it. So they're too conservatives, and in that sense, connected to the ethical issues that was before, today's frontiers is tomorrow's ethics. Okay, yeah. So this is roughly the same problem. You're talking to people that don't want to deal with new issues because they like the way things are.
Which are bioethical. Sorry.
On the other hand, they might be the only ones that really care about their patients. I mean, that's the other side of it.
Completely, but they're very...
That's what I wanted to mean, that bioethical implications, because if you have to expose anyone to potential risk and you have an alternative, it makes sense. In that case, there was no clinical solution. There was, in any case, they were incurable degenerative diseases. They are incurable diseases. So, the point of view of clinician is the one who can explain you the meaninglessness of some pictures and of some videos that pretended to show that there was an improvement, because there was no, I mean, the improvement was not related to anything done, but it was physiologic.
Okay, we have less than 10 minutes, so we have to rush. We can do two things. We go on with pro and cons, or we try to give like a sort of list, to list them, to give the list. Let's say if you have to list them, which is the most trustable on the first and the less trustable at the end. And from a journalistic point of view, pay attention. You have to write a piece on this. So I'm writing something for the general public. So what's the first, where do I have to go first? Number one.
If you have time,
yeah.
You have lots of time for research, you go to PubMed and read lots of papers.
Okay. I agree.
You don't have.
If you don't
yeah, but I agree with you that
if
we
you
have
don't
to
have time, you have to talk to people.
Okay, but we will. Do you have some other different opinions for the first place?
I would go to colleagues.
You will go to?
To my colleagues.
To your colleagues. Yeah, your colleagues, journalists.
Yeah.
They did part of the way already.
Yeah. This is the way scientists work. So. We work with our colleagues usually.
Yeah.
And get some free coffee on the way. So.
Yeah. You can are there other colleagues? Yeah, we do this. We have, as a Science Journalist Association, we have a mailing list that is very useful. And we often ask our colleagues, I'm writing about this, can you help me to find a good expert, can you help me to understand this? Also because we have different backgrounds, so if they are writing on neuroscience, they will ask me, and if I write on physics, I have to ask for physics.
I think that you need to have two criteria here. One is who can help you. Number two, who can destroy your article if you do not include them into the interviewing.
This is a very interesting thing, yeah.
How effective, from the point of view of those outside, are your choices?
I would say that I have to put, as a journalist, the number 3 and 4 are the doctors who made the treatment and the patients. I think that I understand that it's not trustable, but it's a huge part of my story. I have to listen to the story I'm writing down, not only based on the scientific point of view, but also on what they are expecting, why they are doing what they are doing, and to explain this. If I miss this part, I'm not doing journalism, I'm doing something else that you can call it also science communication, science education, but the very important thing that I have to say is that the journalist has not the duty to educate public. They have the duty to inform public, which is really, really different. These are two different jobs. Journalists and communicators have two different jobs. It's like to say, I would say, what if I cover politics? Do you think I have to explain the Constitution to my reader, or I have to give them all the information to decide who is the best party, who is the good politician to vote, and so on? I have to give information, so I don't have to explain the basics. Of course, as I cover a very difficult topic, I have to deal with words. So if I use the word stem cell, I will describe it, because I'm not sure that all the readers can understand what a stem cell is. So of course I give some background information, but my job is to give information. And I think...
If I can add one important detail I suggest to always consider, is that when we speak about journalism, we already have the trouble understanding exactly what's the difference between journalism and science journalism. But then every professional knows that, except, there are some journalists who grow in a specific media and spend their own life in that media, in that specific journal, or newspaper, or weekly, or TV show, and they learn the rules of their own job, which may be different from the rules of the competition. So the point is, in my view, that we have many kinds of journalism, and in some cases we have high-level science journalism, like the piece by Nature, which become the background material we discussed before. So in the best possible ecosystem, you have a journalist, or at least someone with the attitude of the journalist, applying a first filter to all the available, who studies a lot on PubMed, who talks with the high-level experts, to provide a clear picture to those who can then understand the first step, because most journalists don't have the knowledge to go to PubMed and get out with something meaningful. So the point is that there are many different forms of journalism, and if you have 1.5 minutes on the radio, you also have to condense so much your message that you need to know what the effect will be, whatever the premise is. So even in judging journalism, it's often not easy to say who did a good job, because the perception of most of the audience is the only evidence that you can collect. If you find 1 million people asking for that therapy, then of course the journalism was bad, along with some other professions. But in other cases, it's much more difficult to understand if they did a good job or not by stretching to adapt to the rules of that media and of that audience.
We have 3 minutes, so I'm sorry, we cannot...
Well, I think we need to conclude the story.
We tell you how the story ended at the moment, so
if it lights rapidly, otherwise I will have to...
Then I will take a picture of the blackboard, and we can do that as an exercise by ourselves.
Is it an American story with them?
Well, at least the supernatural may intervene, so we will probably have a Deus ex machina, like an old Greek stories. Because last month, the first result of the clinical trial decision of the fund of the clinical trial was that finally this Stamina Foundation was forced to bring the documents to the health authorities to look into this self-declared protocol, and the evaluation of the scientific committee was that the therapy doesn't have the preconditions, so it's potentially dangerous, so that the trial cannot take place, which started only a new chapter of this story, because the day before yesterday, yes, on November 2nd, that psychologist Davide Vannoni used his Facebook page to write an open letter to Pope Francesco. Because Pope Francesco, as you probably know, we know a lot because we have him in Italy, uses a lot of phone. So he calls a lot of people, and on the newspapers in Italy we have the accounts of those who received a phone call from the Pope. And among those who received a phone call from the Pope, there was a family with a kid that was one of those in the media for that. And there was a first attempt a couple of weeks ago to present that as the intervention of the Pope, who would ask the Italian health authorities to provide the therapies, but that was rejected. The Vatican's press office said there was no reference to the health authorities in Italy. But then finally, this is the new stunt, the new genius move by this psychologist, expert of marketing, who wrote this letter in which he touches all the emotional, highly charged points, emotionally charged, including the allegation to the bad scientists to be those who were in favor of research on embryonic stem cells and those who are in favor of euthanasia. So he depicted them as the evil, and he called the Pope to help those poor children to keep hope alive.
His sentence is very, very strong. They represent an hymn to death, starting from the embryo to end up with 8 and 6 children. So you can imagine what's the impact of this kind of sentence in a Catholic country like Italy.
But then we will see what the Vatican, if they decide to not to answer, or they will be forced to answer some way. But this is the new level, and we still have to deal with this in Italy, and we will still have to deal with this for a long time, I feel.
So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.